Hello, I'm Melissa Hetrick with the City of Santa Barbara Planning Division, and I'm project manager on the city's sea level rise adaptation plan. The purpose of this presentation is to present the findings of a draft sea level rise adaptation plan that was released and is available for public review and comment on our website, www.santabarbaraca.gov/SLR. During this presentation, I'll first provide some background on the development of the adaptation plan. We'll go through Santa Barbara's vulnerability to sea level rise hazards if nothing is done. I'll then talk about the recommendations in the plan related to adapting to or mitigating the impacts of sea level rise. And then we'll close with information for how to get involved. So a little background. To date, sea levels have only risen a very small amount in Santa Barbara. However, sea level rise is expected to accelerate significantly in upcoming years. It's for these reasons that the city's general plan and coastal plan direct the preparation of a sea level rise adaptation plan for Santa Barbara. In addition, sea level rise analysis is now required for coastal development permitting in addition to most other types of permitting and grant funding activities at the state level. In 2019, the city certified a new coastal land use plan that included interim policies that address sea level rise hazards in coastal development permitting. It also required the city to follow up with a more comprehensive adaptation plan for the whole city. And so we embarked on that comprehensive adaptation plan process in 2018. In fall of 2018, we released a draft vulnerability assessment that identifies parts of the city and public and private assets that could be affected by increased erosion and flooding as a result of sea level rise through the year 2100. This plan looked at what would happen if no action is taken. We have now released the draft adaptation plan that looks at options to address the increased hazards associated with sea level rise over time. The document includes the findings from the vulnerability assessment. It provides a framework for decision-making and planning for sea level rise in phases. It considers a wide range of adaptation options, providing the city flexibility to consider different adaptation options at different times. It also includes an economic and fiscal impacts analysis. A draft plan has been released, and we are now in the process of letting the public and decision makers review the draft plan and provide comments. We will then compile all those comments, make any edits that are needed, and a revised plan will be reviewed by the city's Sea Level Rise Subcommittee for a recommendation, and then considered for adoption by City Council. So let's take a look at what the 2018 vulnerability assessment said about the potential impacts of sea level rise in Santa Barbara if no action is taken. There's a number of factors that affect the rate of sea level rise occurring off of Santa Barbara. These include things such as how the Antarctic ice sheet is melting, thermal expansion of seawater from warming of the ocean circulation patterns, and global greenhouse gas emissions. All of these factors are changing, and new information is coming out all the time about how they may change in the future. So what this means is a few things. First, sea levels are not rising uniformly throughout the world. In addition, the farther you go out in time, the more difficult it is to accurately predict sea level rise amounts in any given area. So what the state of California is doing is that every 5 years, they are compiling all the scientific studies and models and updating what's called the State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance, which essentially tells each city and county throughout the state how much sea level rise they should be planning for. This graph shows the projections for Santa Barbara contained in the 2018 state guidance. The lowest line in orange being the most probable scenario, and the red line on top being the most conservative or risk-adverse scenario. The city's vulnerability assessment uses the middle line, which projects 0.8 feet of sea level rise by 2030, 2.5 feet by 2060, and 6.6 feet by 2100. This projection is a conservative, risk-averse projection that the state recommends using for comprehensive city planning and planning for permanent structures and development. The state projects that this scenario has a 1 in 200 chance of occurring. So I would just note that if you follow all of these projections, even the lower line, out further in time, you'll see that in each case, Santa Barbara reaches 6.6 feet of sea level rise. It just either occurs earlier or later, depending on the scenario. Given the uncertainty associated with when particular amounts of sea level rise amounts may occur in the future, the city's sea level rise adaptation plan makes recommendations for actions based on reaching actual measured amounts of sea level rise, rather than giving direction for specific years when those sea level rise amounts may occur. So in the adaptation plan, the term near term means between 0 and 0.8 feet of sea level rise. Midterm is between. So just quickly, these are the types of coastal hazards that the vulnerability assessment looked at. Tidal inundation is flooding from regular high tides during non-storm conditions. The plan also looks at year-to-year beach erosion and bluff erosion. The plan looks at flooding during 100-year storm events and looks at the area where waves will be breaking with velocity during a 100-year storm. It also looks at areas which are not directly connected to the ocean, but which might flood more frequently. So these are the hazard maps contained in the vulnerability assessment, and I would just note that we have these maps on our website interactively, and so you can actually type in an address and zoom in and see what hazards might be present at a very particular address. This is the west side of the city that is predominantly coastal bluffs. This shows erosion hazards in orange and yellow, bluff erosion hazards for 0.8 feet of sea level rise. This hazard map is very close to existing conditions. Our bluffs are at risk now from bluff erosion hazards. By 2.5 feet of sea level rise, bluff erosion rates could increase by 40% over historic rates, with bluff erosion affecting many private properties and select locations of Shoreline Drive near Ledbetter Beach. At 2.5 feet of sea level rise, it is projected that approximately 80% of the beaches backed by bluffs will be lost. This is 6.6 feet of sea level rise. By this time, bluff erosion rates are 140% higher than historical rates, and bluff erosion has reached multiple points along Shoreline Drive. All the bluff-back beaches at this point have been lost. This is the east side of the city that is backed predominantly by low-lying areas in the waterfront. The light aqua color is regular tidal inundation. The dark blue color is flooding during 100-year storms, and the purple is the area where waves break during storms. This is 0.8 feet of sea level rise. Again, this is very similar to existing conditions. The predominant areas impacted are the areas by the harbor and along the beach during storms, as is true today. By 2.5 feet of sea level rise, we still see most of the impacts remaining south of Cabrillo Boulevard. At this point, without intervention, we could lose about 30% of our beaches, but this area along the waterfront is better protected because of the harbor breakwater, which retains sand and also protects the West Beach neighborhood. At 2.5 feet of sea level rise, however, by 6.6 feet of sea level rise, impacts extend well beyond Cabrillo Boulevard into the low-lying areas of downtown. The dark blue area north of Highway 101, for the most part, floods now during high rainfall events. With 6.6 feet of sea level rise, this area would experience the same depth of flooding, but in a higher frequency of flooding, as it would flood not just during high rainfall events, but also during high wave or coastal storm events. South of Highway 101 would be impacted by regular flooding during high tides, as shown in the light aqua color, and more frequent and more extensive and deeper floods during coastal storm events. Highway 101 could be flooded near the bird refuge during storms, and the railroad could be impacted by regular high tides. If nothing is done, beach loss in this area at 6.6 feet of sea level rise would be approximately 60%. So those are the potential impacts if no action is taken. We'll now move into the recommendations in the draft adaptation plan to mitigate these impacts. Given the quickly emerging flow of new information on sea level rise, adaptation, legislation, and funding, planning for sea level rise truly requires a phased approach. And in some cases, it would actually behoove us to wait on decisions until more information is collected. The adaptation plan presents a phased approach to adaptation planning based upon monitoring of changing shoreline conditions and implementing actions when certain thresholds or triggers are met. It recommends specific near-term actions the city could take in the next 10 years to prepare for sea level rise, and then proposes a structure for decision-making and possible options in the mid and long term. Following adoption of the adaptation plan, it is recommended that the city develop a 5-year implementation plan that further prioritizes and scopes out near-term actions, including identifying specific costs, potential funding, timelines, and required resources for the near-term actions. One of the first near-term actions would be development of a shoreline monitoring program in conjunction with other regional agencies. The results of the shoreline monitoring program would inform regular updates to the 5-year implementation. So the adaptation plan took a close look at a number of adaptation options, and they generally fall into 3 major categories. Protection of development in place through measures such as seawalls, revetments, groins, breakwaters, tide gates, beach nourishment. Accommodation of development in place through measures such as elevation or modifications of existing structures. And then retreat through measures such as relocation of structures or limitations in development in buffer areas. I did just want to talk about revetments and seawalls specifically, as they are brought up frequently. The top picture is a rock revetment and the bottom is a seawall. These structures are designed to slow down erosion of the shoreline landward from where they are placed. However, their placement can cause increased erosion of the beach in front of and on both sides of the structures, as when waves hit these structures, instead of dissipating on a gradual shoreline, the waves get reflected with a lot of energy and increase in erosion. Because of this, you often will not see these structures alone in one small area. Inevitably, they are needed on neighboring properties, and that leads to entire sections of coast being armored. They are also expensive to build and maintain, especially with changing conditions such as sea level rise. So in summary, they can be effective at protecting structures in place for a period of time, and they are appropriate in some situations, but they come at costs that need to be considered. Because of these costs, Santa Barbara has had a long history of limiting these structures along its shoreline to only very particular use. The following are specific recommendations from the adaptation plan for different parts of the city. Along the coastal bluff, beach nourishment and sand retention with groins or breakwaters was not found to be effective in the adaptation plan due to the high rate of sand transport along the bluffs. Essentially, as soon as you'd be able to place sand on these beaches, it would wash away. What this means is there really isn't an effective option to stop the significant erosion of beaches that will occur along the bluffs due to sea level rise. There are feasible options, though, to protect important infrastructure from bluff erosion with the use of rock revetments and slope protection. However, the report finds that due to permitting constraints, significant costs, and impacts to beaches, that at least in the near term, use of rock revetments should only be limited to protecting major public roads, public access stairways, or major public infrastructure. And to the extent feasible, non-essential public infrastructure should be relocated and removed. So the report recommends in the near term to continue the current practice of requiring bluff setbacks for new development and redevelopment that factor in increased rates of erosion from sea level rise. It also recommends continuing the city's current practice of limiting use of revetments to only those uses that protect major public roads and public beach access stairways. In the near term, the plan also recommends relocating and removing assets in Shoreline Park. In the mid and long term, as the majority of the beaches are lost along the bluff and erosion continues, the city will need to consider whether to allow larger scale use of revetments and slope stabilization to protect shoreline drive in place, or whether to plan for alternate circulation routes and relocation of infrastructure. Along the low-lying and waterfront areas, the beaches will erode much slower, and there's a lot more opportunity to retain beaches through measures such as beach nourishment. This is predominantly due to the presence of the harbor breakwater and topography of the coast in this area. The harbor breakwater helps retain sand on waterfront beaches and also protects not just the marinas in the harbor, but also the West Beach neighborhood and City College areas. The key issue in this low-lying area is the long-term potential for extensive tidal inundation and storm flooding. In the near term, recommendations for the low-lying area include a number of things, such as looking at increased beach nourishment, additional use of seasonal sand berms, and possible formation of sand dunes along the beaches to slow erosion. There's also an existing tide gate that prevents flooding up Laguna Creek, as pictured, as shown in the lower picture on the slide. That gate needs to be raised and redesigned. In addition, there are large sewer mains located along the beach, along the waterfront, that serve to collect sewer flows from the rest of the city and feed them into the El Estero Water Resource Center, our wastewater treatment plant. These sewer mains and other utility infrastructure under the beach need to either be relocated or flood-proofed in the near term to ensure continued operation of the sewer system in El Estero Water Resource Center. The report also recommends that in the areas south of Highway 101 that could experience tidal inundation and more extensive storm flooding in the future, that the city consider potential revisions to floodplain and building regulations to require new and substantially redeveloped buildings to be flood-proofed and raised to a higher level than required now. The plan also recommends that we continue to require development located south of Cabrillo to be designed and sited to allow for increased hazards from sea level rise. In addition, in order to prepare for potential impacts in the long term, detailed studies of the wastewater, stormwater, and water systems are, we get a lot of questions about the El Estero Water Resource Center. This treatment facility is actually located on a higher ground than surrounding areas. The more pressing issue in the next 30 years for the sewer system is addressing impacts to the sewer collection system that flows into El Estero more than the El Estero site itself. In the mid and long term, the city will need to consider whether to employ larger scale flood protection measures for the low-lying areas of the city. In order to effectively mitigate flood hazards in this area in the long term, there would likely have to be flood protection measures placed in combination. So there would have to be a combination of seawalls and levees extending along the entirety of the waterfront, levees or flood walls along lower portions of major creeks in the waterfront area, groundwater dewatering wells, and stormwater pumps. The city could also consider relocation and flood proofing of critical facilities. There are a lot of unknowns and feasibility questions, legal questions, and other questions about these options, and significant study would need to be conducted in the near and midterm to make the eventual decision on these large-scale flood protection measures. At the harbor, the report recommends that in the near term, the city pursue first raising the breakwater, groin, and groin that forms the sand spit to protect the harbor and West Beach neighborhoods. It's possible that the city could pursue funding and studies through the Army Corps of Engineers for these activities. Other near-term recommendations are to raise the sidewalk around the harbor, adjacent to the commercial and parking areas. In the near term, the marinas and pier should also be raised with higher piles and phases as they are renovated. And this slide has a good picture there of the breakwater and groin that would need to be raised. In the mid and long term, the city will need to decide whether to raise the grades of the harbor commercial area or relocate or remove some facilities from the harbor area. The city will also need to decide whether to raise, redesign, or remove Stearns Wharf, which will be subject to higher risks from storm damage during high wave events, which makes a number of other recommendations for the city in general or citywide. As mentioned previously, it recommends establishment of a shoreline monitoring program and a 5-year implementation plan. It recommends that the city amend policies, procedures, and adjust staffing to implement these plans and programs. It recommends amending the capital improvement program, the city's local coastal program, general plan, hazard mitigation plan, and municipal code to implement recommended near-term projects and policies, and that the city pursue funding from state and federal agencies for these projects. The report also recommends that the city consider more extensive use of hazard disclosures and risk indemnifications for the city's actions and leases moving forward. The adaptation plan also recommends increased coordination with other agencies, ensuring that the legislature and other decision makers understand the needs of the city moving forward with regard to sea level rise adaptation. Other recommendations include continuation of the existing sea level rise subcommittee and interdepartmental staff team, additional public engagement and public education, and recommendations that the city closely follow emerging information on adaptation options, case law, and sea level rise science. I've given a sampling of the report's findings in the presentation, but there is a whole lot more I haven't covered. And so we really encourage you to take a look at the draft report and send us any comments you may have. Our webpage is www.santabarbaraca.gov/SLR. On there, you'll find the full document and the executive summary. You will find the interactive hazards maps that I described. You can sign up for our interested party notification list and get information on public meetings and informational sessions. You can send any comments or questions to me, Melissa Hetrick, via email at slrplan@santabarbaraca.gov or call me at the number listed on the screen. Thanks for listening to this presentation. We hope that you will take a look at the report and get involved in the city's efforts to prepare for sea level rise moving forward. Thank you.